I remember the exact moment the doors of my courtroom opened that morning, the heavy oak panels parting just enough to let arrogance walk in before the man himself fully appeared. And I could feel it before I even saw him, that suffocating presence of entitlement that tends to cling to certain individuals like an expensive cologne, invisible yet overwhelming. And as he stepped forward, slow, deliberate, almost theatrical, I watched him with the same stillness I have mastered over decades on the bench, my eyes unmoving, my expression unreadable. But inside, something cold and sharp began to form, because I have seen wealth before. I have seen power. I have seen influence attempt to bend justice. But there was something different about this young man, something louder, more careless, more dangerous. The way he smiled as if this entire courtroom was a stage built for his amusement, the way his polished shoes echoed too confidently against the floor, the way his tailored suit screamed money, but his posture screamed disrespect. And I remember thinking, quietly, firmly, this one will learn. He didn't just walk in, he invaded the space, his chin slightly raised, his eyes scanning the courtroom, not with concern, not with caution, but with boredom, as if he had been dragged into something beneath him. And I watched the subtle reactions ripple through the room, the clerk stiffening, the bailiff narrowing his eyes, even the air itself feeling tighter, heavier. And when his gaze briefly met mine, there was no fear there, no recognition of authority, just a flicker of amusement, almost as if he had already decided the outcome of this case in his favor. And I leaned back ever so slightly in my chair, folding my hands, reminding myself of the discipline that has carried me through decades of cases far darker than this. But I could already sense the storm forming beneath the surface, the kind of storm that begins in silence, slow, controlled, inevitable. I turned my attention to the case file, letting the pages speak before I allowed myself to speak, because documents do not lie, evidence does not posture, and as I read slowly, deliberately, I could feel the weight of what was written pressing deeper into my chest, each line revealing not just an act, but a pattern, not just a mistake, but a mindset. And I lifted my eyes again, studying the young man more carefully now, noting the slight smirk that hadn't left his face, the casual way he leaned toward his lawyer, as if discussing dinner plans instead of a legal proceeding. And I thought to myself, I have seen many cases, but this one is not about a single action. This is about character, about the dangerous intersection of wealth and the belief that consequences are optional. As the proceedings began, I allowed the prosecution to lay out the narrative, step by slow step, and the room grew quieter with each detail, the story unfolding not in dramatic bursts, but in a steady, suffocating rhythm that made it impossible to ignore the truth. And I watched as the victim's name was introduced, a 90-year-old veteran, a man who had lived nearly a century, who had seen wars, sacrifice, hardship, and survival. And I felt a shift inside me, something deeper than anger, something rooted in respect. Because men like that do not simply exist. They endure. They carry history in their bones. And to see his name connected to this case, to this young man's actions, it stirred something personal, something unyielding. The prosecution described the incident in detail, how the old man had been approached, how his vulnerability had been exploited, how his dignity had been stripped away not just by the act itself, but by the cruelty that followed. And I listened carefully, my face still, my hands steady, but my mind absorbing every word, every pause, every inflection, because justice is not rushed. It is built, layer by layer, truth by truth. And as the story deepened, I could feel the courtroom shifting, the earlier tension now replaced by something heavier, something more somber, the kind of silence that carries weight, that demands accountability. When it was the defendant's turn to speak, I watched him closely, leaning slightly forward, my eyes fixed, my patience intact but finite. And he began not with remorse, not with explanation, but with laughter, a quiet, dismissive chuckle that echoed far louder than he intended. And I felt it, that moment, that precise moment where something inside me hardened, not out of emotion, but out of clarity. Because laughter in the face of harm, in the presence of pain, is not ignorance, it is choice, and I have no tolerance for that choice in my courtroom. His lawyer attempted to intervene, speaking quickly, nervously, trying to redirect, to soften the narrative. But the young man continued, his words dripping with entitlement, his tone casual, almost bored, as he dismissed the severity of the situation, as if the victim's age, his history, his humanity meant nothing. And I allowed him to speak. I allowed him to reveal himself fully, because sometimes the most powerful evidence is not what is presented, but what is exposed through arrogance, through carelessness, through the inability to recognize the gravity of one's own actions. I remember the exact way the victim was brought in, slowly, carefully, supported by a cane and the quiet respect of those around him, and the entire courtroom shifted, the energy changing in a way that cannot be described, only felt, and I straightened in my chair, my gaze softening just slightly, acknowledging the presence of a man who had earned more respect in his lifetime than the defendant could comprehend. And as he took his seat, I noticed the tremor in his hands, the weight in his eyes, and I knew, without a single word spoken, that what he carried into this room was heavier than anything written in that file. When he began to speak, his voice was fragile yet steady, each word carefully chosen, each sentence carrying the weight of memory. And I listened, not just as a judge, but as a human being, absorbing the pain, the confusion, the disbelief that someone could treat him in such a way. And I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one I have learned to control, to contain, because emotion cannot dictate judgment, but it can inform understanding, and understanding is essential for justice. He spoke of dignity, of respect, of the simple expectation that at 90 years old, he would be allowed to live his remaining days without humiliation, without cruelty. And as he spoke, I noticed the defendant still leaning back, still detached, still unmoved. And that contrast, that stark, undeniable contrast between lived experience and careless entitlement, it settled heavily in the room, pressing down on everyone present. I could feel the courtroom holding its breath as the victim described the moment that broke him, the laughter, the mocking tone, the complete disregard for his humanity, and I saw his eyes well with tears, not of weakness, but of accumulated pain, and I remained still, my hands clasped, my expression controlled, but inside I was measuring, evaluating, deciding, because justice is not just about law, it is about balance, about restoring what can be restored, and addressing what must be addressed. When the defense attempted to minimize the incident, to frame it as a misunderstanding, a harmless interaction blown out of proportion, I felt that sharp edge return, that internal line being drawn, because I have heard every excuse, every deflection, every attempt to reshape reality, and I have learned to see through them all, to recognize when truth is being buried beneath convenience. And I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but firm, reminding them that this courtroom is not a place for distortion, it is a place for truth. The defendant, however, seemed incapable of understanding that, and when he spoke again, his words were careless, dismissive, and once more he laughed, a sound that echoed louder than before, harsher, more grating, and this time I did not simply observe, I intervened, my voice cutting through the room with precision, controlled but unmistakably authoritative, reminding him exactly where he stood. And for the first time, I saw a flicker, just a flicker, of uncertainty in his eyes. As the proceedings moved toward their conclusion, I could feel the weight of the decision forming, not as a sudden realization, but as a steady, inevitable progression, each piece of evidence, each word spoken, each reaction observed contributing to a clear, undeniable picture. And I sat there from my bench, reviewing it all, not just the facts, but the character behind them, the intent, the impact, the complete absence of remorse. When I finally began to speak, the room fell into absolute silence, the kind of silence that carries anticipation, that demands attention, and I took my time, my words measured, deliberate, each sentence building upon the last, not out of anger, but out of purpose, because this was not just about punishment. This was about accountability, about drawing a line that cannot be ignored, cannot be crossed without consequence. I addressed him directly, my gaze unwavering, my tone steady but firm, outlining not just what he had done, but what it represented, the arrogance, the entitlement, the complete disregard for another human being. And I made it clear that wealth does not grant immunity, that status does not erase responsibility, and that in this courtroom, every individual stands equal before the law. As I continued, I could see the shift happening. Slowly, visibly, his confidence cracking, his posture changing, his expression tightening, and I did not rush. I allowed that realization to settle, to grow, to take root, because understanding consequences is not an instant process. It is a moment that must be experienced fully. When I delivered the sentence, I did so with absolute clarity, outlining every consequence, every financial repercussion, every legal impact, ensuring that there was no room for misunderstanding, no space for interpretation. And as the words left my mouth, I watched the transformation unfold, shock turning into disbelief, disbelief into fear, and fear into something far more human, something far more real. He tried to speak, to interrupt, to plead, but I did not allow it, my authority unwavering, my decision final. And as the bailiff stepped forward, I watched as the reality of the situation fully settled upon him, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away, replaced by desperation, by the sudden, crushing understanding that actions have consequences, regardless of wealth, regardless of status. Months later, I would occasionally think back to that case, not with satisfaction, but with reflection, considering the impact, the outcome, the balance that had been restored, and I would hear updates, quiet mentions of the defendant's losses, his reputation diminished, his life altered in ways he had never anticipated. And I would also hear of the victim slowly recovering, finding moments of peace, supported by those who respected him, who valued his life, his history, his dignity, and that more than anything reminded me why this role exists, why justice must be firm, must be unwavering. Because in the end, it is not money that defines a person, not power, not influence, but character. And when character fails, when arrogance replaces humanity, the consequences are not just inevitable, they are deserved. And as I have always believed and will always uphold, respect is not optional, and justice does not bend for those who think they are above it. I remember the quiet that followed in the days after that sentence, a different kind of silence than the one that filled my courtroom. This one slower, more reflective, the kind that lingers in the spaces between thoughts. And I found myself revisiting the case, not because I doubted my decision, but because cases like that do not simply end when the gavel falls. They echo, they leave impressions, they force you to examine not just the law, but the nature of people. And I would sit in my chambers long after the last file had been closed, thinking about that young man's face in those final moments, the way his arrogance collapsed under the weight of reality. And I would ask myself, quietly, whether that moment had truly reached him, whether it had broken through the layers of entitlement that had protected him for so long, or whether it was simply another inconvenience in a life that had never required accountability. In the weeks that followed, reports began to surface, not through official channels, but through the quiet murmurs that always find their way into the legal world, whispers of financial restructuring, of assets being seized, of legal teams scrambling to contain the damage. And I listened without reaction, because I have learned that consequences rarely unfold in dramatic bursts. They unravel slowly, methodically, each thread pulling at the next until the entire fabric begins to collapse. And I imagined, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, what that must have felt like for someone who had never been denied, never been told no, never been forced to face the limits of their own power. I also received a letter, handwritten, careful, deliberate, from the veteran, and I remember the weight of it in my hands before I even opened it, the way the paper felt slightly worn, as if it carried more than just ink. And as I read his words, I found myself slowing down, absorbing each sentence, each expression of gratitude, not for the punishment itself, but for the recognition, for the simple act of being heard, of being seen. And I realized once again that justice is not always about severity. Sometimes it is about acknowledgement, about restoring a sense of dignity that was taken. And I sat there holding that letter, feeling a rare moment of quiet validation, not for myself, but for the system that, when it works as it should, can still protect those who need it most. But what stayed with me the longest was not the letter, not the reports, not even the sentence itself. It was that moment of laughter, that brief, careless sound that had echoed through my courtroom, because it represented something far larger than a single case. It represented a mindset, a belief that consequences are negotiable, that respect is optional, that power can shield you from accountability. And I have seen that belief before, in different forms, in different faces. And each time it ends the same way, not always immediately, not always publicly, but inevitably. Because reality has a way of asserting itself, of demanding balance, of correcting what arrogance attempts to distort. Months turned into more than that, and I would occasionally hear updates about the young man, fragments of a life that had shifted dramatically, stories of isolation, of former allies distancing themselves, of opportunities disappearing, and I would consider those changes carefully, not as punishment, but as consequence, because there is a difference, a distinction that many fail to understand. Punishment is imposed, but consequence is earned. It is the natural result of actions taken without regard for others. And in that sense, what he was experiencing was not something I had given him. It was something he had created for himself, long before he ever stepped into my courtroom. I often reflect on the role of influence, of upbringing, of the environments that shape individuals. And I wondered, not as an excuse, but as an inquiry, what had led him to that point, what had reinforced the belief that he was untouchable, that his actions carried no weight. And I thought about the people around him, the voices that had either encouraged or failed to challenge that mindset. Because accountability is not just a legal concept, it is a social one. It is built over time, reinforced through boundaries, through consequences, through the simple act of being told no. And when that is absent, when that structure is missing, the results can be as destructive as anything I have witnessed. The veteran, on the other hand, became a quiet symbol in my mind, not of victimhood, but of resilience. And I would occasionally revisit his testimony, not in detail, but in essence, remembering the steadiness in his voice, the dignity in his presence, the way he carried himself despite everything that had been taken from him in that moment. And I found a certain clarity in that contrast between a life built on experience, on sacrifice, on endurance, and a life built on privilege, on excess, on the absence of limits, and it reinforced something I have always known. But cases like this make impossible to ignore. That character is not inherited, it is formed, it is chosen, it is tested. There were moments, brief but undeniable, where I questioned whether the severity of the sentence would truly lead to change, whether it would serve as a turning point or simply a detour. And I reminded myself that my role is not to predict transformation. It is to enforce accountability, to ensure that the law is applied without bias, without hesitation, and that any change that follows is the responsibility of the individual, not the expectation of the court. Because justice does not guarantee redemption, it only creates the conditions where redemption becomes possible. I remember one particular afternoon, months later, when I saw him again, not in my courtroom, but in a different setting, a brief, unexpected encounter. And he was not the same person who had walked in that day. The confidence was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more uncertain. And our eyes met for just a moment. And in that moment, I saw recognition, not of me as an individual, but of what I represented, of the boundary that had been drawn. And he looked away quickly, not out of defiance, but out of understanding. And I did not speak, I did not acknowledge it, because some lessons are not meant to be discussed. They are meant to be lived. And as I returned to my bench, to the steady rhythm of cases, of decisions, of the constant balancing of law and humanity, I carried that experience with me, not as a burden, but as a reminder, a reinforcement of the principles that guide every judgment I make, that justice must remain firm, must remain impartial, must remain resistant to influence, because the moment it bends, even slightly, it fails not just the individuals involved, but the system as a whole. Because in the end, what defines us is not what we have, not what we can take, not what we can avoid, but how we choose to act when faced with the opportunity to either respect or disregard another human being. And I have seen time and time again that those who choose arrogance over humanity eventually stand where he stood, stripped of illusion, confronted by reality, and forced to understand a truth that cannot be escaped, that the law may be patient, but it is never powerless, and justice, when it finally arrives, does not whisper. It speaks with absolute finality.